I mean, and I got a pretty strong stomach, man, but it is one of the most disturbing things I've ever experienced in pre-hospital medicine. I'm telling you, it's just gross. I had a lingering back injury that got worse as time went on, and my insomnia was getting worse until it got to the point where I couldn't no longer hide the fact that my back was hurt. I ended up having to go to see the PA.
Welcome to How I Embraced the Suck, a podcast where you get to hear from veterans what life in the military is really like. I am your host, Walt, and before we start, you should know that I do not censor the show in any way. You have been warned. All right, well, today we have with us Matt, a former Army medic who is now trying to be a civilian medic. Matt, what's up?
What's going on, man?
Glad you could be on the show here, and I hope the audience really gets something out of this. Go ahead and, for the audience, that might not know your background, go ahead and give them a little overview of your time in.
Sure. So I joined the Army in 2004, right out of high school. And this was, I know probably a lot of listeners to these shows now don't have much of a recollection of what America was like at that point in time. And, that's kind of one of the indications that you're starting to get a little older, is that you start to have to kind of give these disclaimers about years gone by. And this was right after 9/11. And that was a really different time in America. I mean, it's like nothing I've never experienced and probably never will. But for the first time, I think in a lot of places, like I grew up in a little kind of conservative town that had this big university next to it. And for the first time, I think ever, you started seeing American flags flying on university campus there. I mean, it was pretty wild. And I think a lot of normies kind of look back at that time and think about how united we were, which in a sense we were, but unfortunately I think the government turned and directed all that unitedness onto something that's not such a positive thing. But anyway, it was, I remember 9/11 very vividly. I was still in high school, and I had a desire to go back, and like a lot of guys my age back then, is to get revenge for the people that attacked us, for these assholes that decided to fly some planes into our buildings. And I remember it's so funny is that looking back on it now, it seems kind of ironic because of how long these wars lasted. But I thought I was going to miss all the action because my only experience with war at that point in time was Desert Storm. And my dad was in Desert Storm, and he was gone for about a year and a half, and that was it. And of course, combat operations in the Desert Storm was over in I think 30 days or maybe 40 days or something like that. And then you had Kosovo, and those are the only kind of really wars I had any consciousness of. So I thought this was going to be one of those other things where America comes in and gets the bad guys and we're out, and back at home, time for dinner, that type of thing. And of course, that's not how it's happened. But anyway, so to give you a kind of a brief overview. So I joined in 2004. I went through AIT and I became 68 Whiskey, which is Army Healthcare Specialist is the official name of the job title. But that MOS specifically, you can do all kinds of things in the Army with it. One of the things that's actually kind of cool about U.S. Army healthcare is that medical providers in general have what's called a scope of practice. So this is something that's set by law by the state, and they say, okay, so if you're a nurse's aide, you're allowed to do these procedures, but you're not allowed to start IVs. Or if you're a paramedic, you're allowed to start IVs, you're allowed to defibrillate somebody, you're allowed to intubate people, but you're not allowed to do, I don't know, you're not allowed to set broken bones. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Whatever. Well, the cool thing about the Army is that, and the Navy too, there's no scope of practice for enlisted medical providers. So you'll have a clinical supervisor, which is usually a PA in the Army. It's usually the medical platoon leader, which is a lieutenant's position. And whatever procedures they're willing to sign off on is stuff they'll let you do. So what you end up happening is you have, especially like a lot of senior enlisted guys, they'll have really expanded responsibilities, and they'll be able to practice some more advanced skills. For example, the Navy, a lot of smaller ships, they don't have an officer, like a commissioned officer is their chief medical officer. They'll have a Navy hospital corpsman who's maybe I can't. I can't. Their rank structure is so goofy. It's like be an
Numbers.
E6 or an E7. Yes, numbers and a chicken and some upside down stripes and I don't know what else, man. But anyway, so you get into some cool situations like that where you get to experience and do things that you'd never get to experience in the civilian world unless you were a doctor or something, equally up there. Like for example, Army medics used to be able to do what's called venous cut downs, which is essentially we have better techniques for this now with the fast one intraosseous access, but essentially medics would be able to make cuts in somebody's leg and actually expose a vein like to the air to get vascular access. And because what happens is and I know we're getting off track here, but already it didn't take long. But what happens is when somebody loses a lot of blood, their veins shrink, and it becomes very hard to insert an IV to give them fluids. So anyway,
right, okay,
yeah. So back to
so you're looking for a bigger
answer.
vein to
Exactly.
Normally that's something a doctor would do or somebody in a OR.
Yeah, and now of course, yeah, that's an obsolete technique now because we have better technology. But it's just the best example I could think of. Quickly.
Yeah.
But anyway, after I did my initial training, I was on post for about 6 months to 8 months, and I got sent to a unit that was doing their workup to go to deploy to Iraq. So I deployed to Iraq in late 2006 and ended up in the eastern side of Baghdad for about a year and I think it was about a year and 2 months there. It was a little under 15 months. And rotated back home in late 2008. And when I got home, I had some problems readjusting back to garrison life. And eventually I started turning to opiates more specifically, but prescription pain pills to deal with the problems I was having at that time. And it was only a matter of time before I got caught. I failed a drug test. I ended up getting discharged out of the Army, what's called other than honorable discharge. And people they get that conflated with a dishonorable discharge. It's not the same thing. It's one step, not quite as bad.
Sure.
Usually dishonorable discharges are reserved for somebody who has committed a crime that would be a felony in a civilian court typically. But one thing that I think people don't really know very well is that the Army your battalion commander and usually higher level commissioned officers are allowed to do what they call administrative separations. So they can give you up to and other than honorable discharge for administrative things. And you don't necessarily have to be convicted of anything in a court martial. Even like just a couple Article 15s, which is our non-judicial punishment there.
Mm-hmm.
Couple, and I mean, you have guys getting kicked out for anything from picking their nose in formation to, having psychiatric issues. Okay, obviously we're being a little facetious with the whole nose in formation.
Right.
But seriously, that's actual. I can't remember the numbers, but there was several hundred guys during OIF that got kicked out for psychiatric issues. What we would recognize today as PTSD, and the problem is that if you get kicked out, if you get removed, if you get ADSEPT, and you get another honorable discharge, that means you're not entitled to any benefits. You don't have any disability. You're going to have to fight like hell to get VA coverage. And you really, all the things that you're promised as a veteran is stuff that you do not get access to. And that's a little better than it used to be, but that used to be the way it was. It was just, you forget it and you had to basically start from square one at that point. So after I had gotten removed from the Army, I kind of drifted for a little while, had some odd jobs. I worked as an EMT for a short period of time, and I eventually got arrested because I was continuing to do drugs, and I moved from OxyContin to heroin more specifically. And I had I started, because the artificially inflated cost of drugs that are illegal, I had started to turn to selling heroin more specifically to support my habit.
Right.
So after a short period of time, I end up getting caught doing that because a friend of mine got pinched by the police. He ended up telling on me, wearing a wire on me. Cops busted down my door, shot my dog, arrested me, and I got thrown in prison for 3 years. So did that 3 years, got out, and ever since then, I've essentially been trying to kind of put my life back together brick by brick.
Sure. Yeah, that's quite an overview. Why?
I know it's a lot.
Jump right into it. Yeah, so you kind of touched on why you joined it. That makes sense. I mean, I'm around the same age, and I
Okay.
remember seeing the first Gulf War. I think we didn't have a TV, but we like borrowed a black and white. My folks or something. I remember seeing black and white pictures and stuff, and then yeah, the whole 9/11 thing and all that. Um, that's probably I guess that would be a question. Did you at the time in '04? Did you find that to be a common? I mean, you weren't going around asking everybody, but was that like a common motivation for recruits at that time? Was just the patriotism and the go give it to them?
Yeah, I think at that time it definitely was. I think something that's kind of unique about that period of time in American history, where a lot of the guys in generations after mine, they went into the military for other reasons. Or especially back in 2008. I mean, we would get guys that were coming through as E2s or E3s, like just out of basic training as enlisted guys, that they were professionals and they lost their jobs during the recession, and the only thing they
Mm,
could do is turn to the military. So while I mean there are plenty of guys who turned to the military for financial reasons, or because they wanted money for college, or they wanted to do something cool with their lives, back then I think there was really a lot more of that kind of greater purpose that civilians tend to think of. The
sure.
reason that people join the military is for patriotism, to defend your country, and all these kind of very large, high-minded ideals. Where that might be true in other periods, but I think it certainly was more true in that period of time. And I come from a
Yeah.
military family anyway. I mean, as far back as I know, there's been men in the U.S. military in one form or another. In every major war, there's been somebody in my family that fought in that war up until the War of 1812. I'm not sure about the Revolution. Family records don't go back that far, but from 1812 on,
Right.
yeah, I've been had a member of my family in every single one of them. So that was the kind of thing where it wasn't really necessarily expected of us, but it was strongly encouraged,
Sure. Yeah.
and
Yeah.
that was a huge influence on my decision. But yeah, that coupled with 9/11, I mean, that was it was we don't think about it now as much because it's become such a part of the fabric of American society. But seeing flyovers of uh, military jets, like like
Hmm.
you know, in the after they play national anthem at football games, both of those things, the national anthem at football games and the flyers of the Jets, those things didn't happen except for maybe what at the Super Bowl
Mm,
or major college games. Or so. If you think
sure.
back to the early '90s, there were plenty of like high level sports events where they didn't play the national anthem beforehand. But now it's like you go to high school games and they play the national anthem beforehand.
Huh.
Yeah, that's a major change.
Yeah. I didn't. I'm not really a sports guy, so I didn't realize. But yeah, that I mean that I can definitely testify to that now. I mean, everybody knows. Like you say, you go to
hmm
any sports event, and it's pretty standard.
Yeah, and who do you see on the field? There's always guys in uniform on the field. A lot of times it's, if you're watching college football, it's the ROTC. And I remember,
Mm,
at the local university down there, they had the ROTC guys. They always had to do push-ups every time our team scored. It was one push-up for every point. That was the big thing. But that's a fixture at every single college football game now.
mm, huh. Why 68 whiskey? Actually, I was gonna rephrase that. Two questions: the recruitment process. Did you get what you anticipated? And two, about 68 whiskey. Why that? And did you choose it, or was it were you just kind of handed that?
Yes, I did pick it.
Okay.
I had this grand plan. I've always wanted to be a doctor ever since I was a little kid. And I thought that the best way I would be able to attain that, because my family doesn't have a ton of money. They were never going to send me to college. They just couldn't afford it, even if it didn't matter how badly they wanted to, they just couldn't have.
Yeah.
So really my ticket to uh, a doctor's, I guess it wouldn't be a doctorate, I guess it'd be a medical degree, would be going to the military and getting money for
Yeah.
college. And especially if you stay in long enough, they'll pay for the entire program if you commission as an officer. And one thing that is highly valued in emergency medicine is experience. And what better way to get some good hands-on
Yep.
experience
Yep.
than going and treating wounds in a combat zone, right? So this is my big grand plan, and the as far as the recruitment process goes, I mean, man, it's really different now than it is then. But back then, it was basically like, here, promise me you haven't killed anybody. We're gonna do your background real quick, and if you haven't killed anybody, or possibly if you haven't raped anybody, if you have, well, maybe we can. Depends on
Right.
how old it was. We can make an exception. Sign here. The bus is out back. I mean, that's
Yeah.
there was. They were actually. They were actually granting waivers for all kinds of things that they would never grant waivers for now. I mean, I got a buddy of mine whose little brother, he got denied because he had back acne, like eczema. You know, yeah. If you have any kind of criminal record now and you have like a misdemeanor, I mean, chances are pretty good that you're not going to be able to get in the military. You might be able to if you have like a couple DUIs or something, but that stuff really gets stacked against you because the recruit pool is so much bigger than their demands were. Is that the
Right.
army now, and the army is usually like the least selective of all the branches. This is
Right.
mostly
Right.
this is, and you can tell too. You can tell on army bases. I mean, like there's, it's a pretty big group of degenerates. I think the only more bigger group of degenerates you see is on Marine Corps post. But
Right.
anyway, it's because they actively.
But they're
seek them
smaller
out.
numbers, so
Yes.
percentage wise, yeah, the Army is definitely a bigger sponge.
Oh, for sure, and like they can't afford to be as selective, unlike the Coast Guard, which essentially like the numbers they have to fill are so small they can afford to kind of pick and choose who they want. But anyway,
Right.
yeah, it was pretty loose. I think I'd spent a total of maybe a month and a half between when I signed my papers and when I shipped off to basic. It was the summer after I graduated high school,
Sure.
and as far as my MOS goes, so 68 whiskey, I don't know sure if it's like this anymore, but it used to be, is that there's no shortage of people that want to be medics, especially combat medics going into the military. And that's one thing I didn't mention before too, is that MOS code doesn't just refer to combat medics. That MOS code actually refers to everything from dental hygienists. They actually might have a different one, but you could essentially, you could be an actual line medic, which is a medic that's attached to an infantry unit or an armored unit. Or you could work in a clinic, or you could work in a hospital being basically an ED tech, like that'd be the kind of civilian equivalent.
Okay.
So there's all different things you can do in this MOS, and I mean, there's guys that work on X-ray machines and do all kinds of stuff. But that's what people think of is combat medics, right? They think of the Wade from Saving Private Ryan or something like
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
And as a result, the Army has no shortage of people that want to be medics. So it's actually a fairly competitive MOS. And even though the Army, like it's one of the, I think it's the second or third most numerous MOS by like number of people that are in it. But the thing is that you have to have a fairly high ASVAB score. At least you used to. You had to have something. I think you had to score something like within the. I want to say you had to have like an Army career score of 6, maybe 7. But essentially, you had to score pretty high in the ASVAB.
Is that out of 10?
No, it's actually out of 7. Like the career score.
Oh, okay.
Now, this could be old information, like because obviously I took the ASVAB almost like 20 years ago.
Yeah.
But it used to be they gave you like a percentile score. So you scored within, like if you scored within the 93rd percentile, that means that you scored better than 93% of people on the test. But you also had a career score of 7, and every MOS had it was 1 through 7, and every MOS had a career score that you had to get the minimum of. So if you wanted to be like let's see, if you want to be like 19 Romeo, if you want to do the fire control radar for the artillery, you had to have a career score of 5 or something like that. And you also had to meet within that. You had to meet like for the different breakdowns, the ASVAB. I can't remember all, but there was like the general technical, and there was like one for math and one for science and one for like mechanical aptitude, and you had to meet certain ones of those too. And like the main thing they wanted you to be as a medic was good at math, which I'm absolutely garbage at math. I still am.
Squeak through though.
Oh, barely. Yeah. But anyway, yeah, I was able to get my first pick.
Nice. Yeah. Well, that's my impression, and I know it varies by person, but my impression is that that's pretty unusual for somebody to get what they want. Usually you have, like you have to score really high and really fill the bill, and depending on their need too.
Yes, the needs of the Army, but that is absolutely true. There are some MOSs that fill it very fast that you'll have a hard time getting into, especially the one, like a lot of the ones that are very small numbers. And just the way the Army goes, that you might get to pick your job. you're probably not going to get to pick where you do it, and you're going to end up in some real backwater ass posts. Like that's the one thing about the Army versus the Navy or the Marines. Obviously all the Navy bases are near the coast or near water, so at least it's somewhere warm and pleasant. But in the Army, you can end up in friggin' Alaska.
Right. Yeah, crazy. Once you were in, you didn't deploy for a little while, correct? You were posted stateside for a while, a little bit.
Yeah. I think it ended up being because medic training, it used to be, I'm not sure how long it is now, but it used to be 16 weeks. And essentially the way it works is that you have, after you go do basic training, then you get sent to AIT, which is at Fort Sam Houston, which is part of Joint Base San Antonio, Texas. And your first 10 weeks there you go what's over the National Registry's EMT basic program. So essentially almost every state in the union has adopted this now, where there's this company called the National Registry of EMTs and Paramedics. And basically what they do is they don't provide it, but it's almost like a third-party certification. It's almost like ASE certification for mechanics. I don't know if you ever see like the...
Sure.
Yeah, you drive by an auto shop and it says ASE certified mechanics. Well, that's not something like that you have to get in order to be a mechanic. And usually that's not like, the state doesn't say that, oh, you have to be ASE certified to work on cars. No, but it's like something it's a test you can go and take just to like prove your competency in a certain part of auto repair for like brakes or not tires, but for like brakes or suspension or transmissions or whatever. But as far as the way the National Registry goes, is that you take their test and you are able to you get put on their list as a nationally registered EMT basic, and most states will take that as like your certification test to be an EMT, to practice in their state. So it's this weird kind of conglomeration where basically what it amounts to is a national certification system. And in the Army, the first 10 weeks of your program, you're doing that course. So every medic, when they graduate AIT, they are a nationally registered EMT basic. This is like supposed to be one of the selling points, is that, oh, you can get out and you get a job as an EMT, making less than you did when you were a private first class. But they won't tell you that part. And the last 6 weeks is combat training. So essentially, Army medics have a number of skills that they're able to do that are way beyond the scope of an EMT basic. IVs is obviously, that's the big one. IV therapy and what now is IO therapy. So I don't know if you've ever seen the fast ones, where essentially it's like a big group of needles and it gets pushed right through the sternum right there. And these needles ended up burying in the bone marrow right here, and that provides vascular access. So like, it's a way to give fluids to somebody or drugs.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, in case you can't get a vein.
Right.
Yeah, it's pretty gnarly to see it done on somebody, man. It's like,
no kidding.
You have this like cylinder you have to push down. It takes like 35 pounds of pressure, which doesn't sound like a lot, but you have to push a lot harder than you think you do, and it's kind of gross. And
how many pounds is CPR supposed to be?
I can't remember how many pounds it is. Like, you're supposed to push down till you have, I guess, it's at least 2 inches. Yeah, okay. It's at least 2 inches. But yeah, I mean, it's the same thing. Like once you start getting the cartilage, until you start getting cartilage to snap and loosen up there,
right?
You might have to push just as hard too. But
right.
Yeah, for the fast one, it is. I mean, and I got a pretty strong stomach, man, but it is one of the most disturbing things I've ever experienced in pre-hospital medicine. I'm telling you, it's just gross. Wow. The feeling, yeah, I don't even know how to describe it. It just bothers the hell out of me.
Yeah.
And we have it's called the Easy IO. Essentially, it's the same thing. It's for IO access now, but it's done in the humeral head. So like, this is like the this little knot under where your shoulder joint is, and it's also can be done in the tibia too. And that's like a little drill. It's like a little handheld deal, like almost like an electric screwdriver. And I've done that plenty of times on live patients, and that doesn't bother me nearly as much as the fast one does. But anyway, the point here is that there's a group of skills that you'll be able to do as an Army medic that you can't do as an EMT out in the civilian world.
Sure.
And that's IV access. That's also drug administration. So medics use The drug formulary that you actually have access to is pretty limited. It's basically limited to pain control drugs, a couple benzodiazepines for seizures and things like that. And that's pretty much it. I mean, you might administer other drugs in the course of your duties, especially if you're working at a clinic or something like that. But as far as drugs like you have access to, it's mostly what you need for trauma, obviously, for obvious reasons.
Yeah.
So what ends up happening is you have this weird kind of combination where a lot of medics that get out of the army, they're rock star, especially like of my generation. They're rock stars when it comes to trauma. They're super experienced. They know all kinds of stuff. They know the ins and outs and things that you might spend 20 years as a civilian paramedic and not be able to gather half the experience that they do.
Yeah.
But the thing that sucks is that you get out and then you go, say you want to go work for a fire department or for an ambulance company. And so you get certified in the state as an EMT, and then you're back to basically being able to do hardly anything but take vital signs and give chest compressions.
Right. You got all these skills and you're just like, let me at it.
Yes, you can't use them. And I think that's the reason a lot of guys quit. Because essentially what you have to do to get back to the level you were is become a paramedic, which is another year of schooling, and it's pretty intensive schooling, and that's just not a commitment a lot of guys want to make. And I certainly understand that. And it's really one big kind of issue with the way the Army does things and there was some proposals for a while to have like a graduated structure to where like, so you do your EMT initial training, but once you hit E4 or E5, we'll send you back for your NCO school. And on top of that, we're going to put you through to make you a paramedic too. So you'll have this higher level of certification kind of as an inducement for staying in. And then that way, when you get out, you'll be able to do something with the experience you have. And it's also like that, because that's one thing that the military tries to push a lot of times is job skills. Is you go to the military, you get all these great career skills, and you'll be able to get this fantastic job. Okay, that might be true if you're a commissioned officer, because I will tell you this: as commissioned officers in the military, corporate headhunters hunt the hell out of those guys when they get out. And I think one thing I remembered pretty distinctly, we were at this field training one time, and I had a buddy of mine who was getting ready to re-up his contract, and it was just because of the simple fact that he was getting ready to have a kid, and he needed health care, and that was the only reason he was going to stay in, is because I mean, TRICARE is some of the best. It's a great thing, really, if you don't have a lot of options, a lot of money. It's really one of the main inducements that guys with families, they get them to stay in.
Okay.
And he was done at this point. He was done with the Army. He was done with deployments. He had enough. If he could have, I'm sure he would have quit. But and he had, as you might imagine, he'd been really kind of fighting with whether to sign another contract or not in his head for a while. But he finally decided that he was going to do what's right for his family, or at least what he thought was. But anyway, I bumped into a group of second and first lieutenants that were all chopping it up, and they were talking about how they were getting all these job offers, and they were getting letters from different corporations and companies that are offering them these nice, 6-figure high-paying jobs because they want guys with leadership skills, which, I mean, there's plenty of second lieutenants out there that can't lead their way out of a paper bag or a hedge maze, let alone in a high-pressure environment. But for whatever reason, corporate America especially loves commissioned officers. So that's a large group they go after. If you're an enlisted guy, maybe not so much.
Right.
And especially if you if you go to combat arms, which is infantry, armor, and artillery, there's not a lot you can do with your job experience. And the Army, after you get in, will tell you this, because a lot of times the career counselors will give you a list of what careers directly transfer over to your job. To your job skills.
Sure.
And for infantry guys, it's like security guard and police officer. And like, that's it.
Good luck.
Yep, exactly. So that's it's an issue, I mean, that the Army's had for a long time. I'm not sure how much they actually care about fixing something like that, but it is a pretty stark difference between what the commercials on TV say and what the actuality is.
Yeah. One thing I'm curious about, and I would anticipate that your answer would be similar to that of an infantryman or a grunt or a trigger pull or whatever. But what was the difference between being on base in the U.S. or on post in the U.S. and then being deployed, both in terms of the importance of your mission, and then also just your actions every day? What? Correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like it'd be similar to an infantryman. Like here in the U.S., you're training. When you're out there, you're doing it. Okay, tell me where I'm wrong.
Well, here, let me back you up real quick. There,
Yeah.
if you're in a good unit, that's the one thing is that I'm only going to speak to my experience too, because it's kind of difficult for me to generalize, because the range of experiences there are just, they're pretty wide. You could be in a unit where it's got a real, shitbag commission, or got a real shitbag officer that doesn't get the training done, just the bare minimum, and you spend up doing a lot of your time. You spend a lot of your time doing menial tasks,
Mm-hmm.
and that's one thing that happens at every level in every MOS, is that during duty hours, you're not training as much as you think you should. We certainly
Okay.
never did. I mean, for my part, it was a little different, because I spent all my time attached to different combat arms units. So I was what you call a line medic. And what this means is that my day looks a lot different than your average infantryman's, at least stateside. So a lot of times what happens is that, we go and we'll do PT in the morning. We'll go to breakfast and then go to morning formation. And when the duty day starts, a lot of times I'd be like, all right, see you guys later. And I go and do my thing, because essentially the way that the rank structure work, or the way that the unit structure is that medics they're part of a headquarters unit, and the medical platoon is part of that headquarters unit too. So that's where your actual build is. But if you're attached to an infantry unit, then you essentially have kind of two chains of command you have to work under. So if that combat arms unit's going to the field for field training, you're going with them, most likely. But on days when they're just doing, when they're painting rocks or cutting grass or doing whatever else nonsense, or just standing around staring at the wall for 10 hours, you're going to be usually what you're going to be doing is you're going to be going over to the TMC, which is True Medical Center, or you're going to be working at a clinic, or you're going to be doing something medical related. And a lot of times that means working sick call. So guys that are trying to get out of work for the day will go over to sick call, and they'll try to get you to feel bad for them enough to let them out of work. Okay, that's a little bit of an exaggeration, but there's plenty of lingering too.
Yeah.
So anyway, you have multiple duties. One is to your medical platoon, but you also have duty. I mean, really, a medic's first priority is to keep the guys in his unit healthy and safe. Like you're supposed to be responsible for health and safety and sanitation, even though it really doesn't kind of work out that way in reality. So that's what happens stateside. And of course, there's plenty of trainings and whatnot, and PowerPoints and classes and nonsense you have to go to as well. But you do get to avoid a lot of the kind of garbage busy work when you're in my position. So that's nice. But as far as overseas goes, the one positive thing, unless you're on one of the really big bases, like what used to be Victory Base Complex or Al Assad, a lot of times kind of discipline over nonsense is relaxed as far as shaving goes or uniform standards. Now, that's not necessarily always the case. There are plenty of places in the Army and plenty of units where you're going to get yelled at for having 5 o'clock shadow just as much overseas as you do back in the States. So, and there are some really stupid things, like our NCO staff, they had this big thing about stripping down to your t-shirts. And this is like, okay, if you're kind of like standing around, like, doing nothing or whatever, you probably should have your full uniform on. But if you're out like digging a ditch, it's kind of a safety issue, honestly, for you to be wearing your full ACUs. And I mean, the uniforms now are a lot better than they used to be, because ACUs are much, much heavier than what do they call them now? OCP is the newest Army uniform.
Oh, the latest iteration of whatever camo they're trying to sell.
Yes, the ACUs, number one, they don't fit quite right. They're very baggy. Nobody looks good in them. two, obviously, I'm sure you've seen the meme of like the guy laying down on his grandma's couch and you can't see him.
Yeah.
So like the camouflage pattern, and it's only good for you camouflaging maybe in a gravel parking lot. But that's
Yeah.
probably about it.
Yeah.
And then also too, the material is a lot heavier than the new OCPs, so they're pretty miserable to wear in the middle of the desert
Sure.
or in a subtropical climate, which whatever you want to call it. And of course, certainly Baghdad's not what I would call desert. It's just miserably hot and humid.
Right.
But anyway, so that was one big thing that you'd have as a constant. But as far as like your typical day goes, it really depends on what you're doing and where you are, because at least on deployments, you're there for a reason. And that's kind of like, it's the difference between Friday night under the lights and 2 days in summertime.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's like it. And there's so much of that attitude, and I completely understand why, because you spend all your time training for the big game. Well, you want to go play. And it might not even have anything to do with like the actual aims of the war or anything like that. It might just be something as simple as that you spend all this time practicing this skill and now you want to use it.
Right.
It's just like now, I mean, like I'm a firefighter now, and I spend so much of my time reading about firefighter stuff or practicing fire skills, whether it's throwing ladders or pulling hose or stuff like that. And when when we're working, we get a fire call come up on the dispatch screen. Everybody's hooting and hollering, getting all excited. It's, we obviously don't want anybody's house to burn down, obviously.
Right.
It's one of those things where it's like you invest so much time honing your skills for that, where it's like, if it's gonna happen, you want to be there, essentially.
Yeah, exactly.
Is kind of the way I always looked at it too. But anyway, back to your question. I mean, it really depends on where you are and when and what you're doing. There's certainly times in units where you might never go outside the wire, or you might be stuck doing what's called QRF, quick reaction force. So this essentially is kind of like, it's like emergency backup for whatever units are operating nearby. Or your unit might be actually tasked with a mission, whether it's going around. A lot of times what we do is we call them freedom circles, but this was presence patrols. So we literally go out and make sure people knew that we were there. Where it's like, yes, I'm sure the giant bright lights and the fact that there's this one area in the city that has consistent power at nighttime and massive diesel vehicles didn't give it away. We have to go outside and walk around and make sure we're there. And sometimes these were mounted patrols. Sometimes these were dismounted patrols.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of times we'd be doing what they call KLEs, and this is key leader engagements. So local sheikhs are kind of bigger members of the community, people that are more important, like local, like the leaders or politicians or whatever. We go out and meet with them, and we talk about, okay, so what are your concerns? What do you need from us? Blah, 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 blah. And that was a big part of what our mission profile was over there. Sometimes we'd be sitting on a target waiting for somebody or to bring something or to come there or something like that. Sometimes we would get information about where weapons caches were, so we'd go on raids after those. Sometimes we would get attached to other units and do the same thing. Other times we would do what's called coordinate knock missions, which is essentially where units will block off a certain part of a city block or multiple city blocks and go door to door looking for weapons or people or whatever, or things like that. But most of the time, most of the missions that you get are not that exciting. They are pretty much basically driving in circles and waiting to get shot at.
Yeah.
That's really about it.
Well, I mean, that could turn to be exciting, I guess.
Oh, certainly, yes. Yeah, and that's the one thing is that, and that's the one biggest difference. Okay, so garrison life really is cancer for the soul. It just sucks on many levels, because it's just, you ever seen the movie Groundhog Day?
Oh yeah, sure.
That's it, dude. It's Groundhog Day. It's the same thing over and over and over and over again. And sometimes you get kind of stuck in this twilight zone, time suck, mind, I don't even know, black hole, where it's just it feels like time moves to a standstill, and every day is exactly the same. And you just get frustrated from your command and every level, and it just it just sucks in general. And everything you want to do is you have to wade through a mountain of bureaucracy first. That's the main thing I think that gets to people, because everything you want to do has to go through this massive impersonal machine. So for example, like if you needed to put in for your leave, Like say you had a family member that's real sick or something like that. And then you have to fax your paperwork to one person. So then you call that person's office and it turns out, hi, I am out of the office until so and so day. So please leave a message and we'll get to it when I get back. So then you're like stuck and you're like, okay, what the hell do I do now? So you go back to your commander and you're like, hey, sir, or more likely you go back to your first sergeant and you tell him, okay,
Yeah.
sorry, like, let's help me out here. What do I need to do? And he's like, well, I don't know. Go ask so and so. So give you some useless question or some useless answers. Then you go to the next person you're supposed to go to, and they can't help you because they have no idea what you're talking about, and it's not their area anyway. So then you're back to square one, and then you have to essentially, it's just you end up in this like MC Escher painting of departments and rules and forms and whatnot, and
Yep.
it's just such an impersonal, dehumanizing experience. It really is, man. And I think that's something that people don't think about a lot, but really does kind of take a toll on you after a while, is that so rarely you're dealing with a person. I mean, there are certainly exceptions to the rule where you're dealing with an actual physical person that actually is
Sure.
concerned and cares about your situation. But so often you're dealing with an office or an agency or a certain unit. And I think that's one thing that gets really frustrating for people. But it's the same thing. It's like if you go to the B&V, man. You go to the B&V, you might get a clerk who's a real sweetheart, who actually is nice and friendly and has a smile on her face. But what are the chances you're going to get somebody who's just down there punching the clock that really doesn't like their job that much, just does it because it's good benefits and a steady paycheck? You know, I mean, the Army is like essentially it's like living in the B&V, man. It really is.
So conversely, maybe that's the right word. There could be a good benefit to that same concept if you have a sergeant or a first sergeant or somebody over you who really does care about you and has that personal connection within your own unit. That would contribute to the situation. But that's, like you say, it's a question of, are you dealing with a person or a group or a command or something.
But the thing is, like, there's only so much they can do. And I think, especially like when you're in the lower levels of enlisted ranks, I think we have a tendency to look at somebody like a captain as like this all-powerful figure. But you got to remember, that guy's got a boss too.
Sure.
It's a battalion commander. And he's got a boss too, the division commander, you know, and he's got a boss too, which is the corps commander. And then he's, you know, like, so they're basically dealing with the same thing at you are. Just the difference is by the time it gets down to your level, it's filtered through so many different layers of bullshit. That's, you know, it's just an unintelligible disaster of, So that's kind of the thing that you got to remember. And I think it took probably some maturity on my part to kind of realize this, is that there is actually a lot of, I mean, I don't want you or your audience to kind of get their wrong idea. Like there's a ton of fantastic people in the military, man. I mean, there's some scumbags too, but there's a lot of really good people that want to do at least what they think is the right thing. But man, I tell you what, just bashing your head against a brick wall for 10 years will give anybody a headache. You know, and you just get so beat down by the system, man. And then and then you get that. And there's plenty of people that really don't want to be there anymore either. They probably shouldn't be, but they get stuck in this trap because the way the retirement system works, you know, if you want to get your full pension, you got to spend 20 years in, you know, if you resign after 17 years, you're not going to get it, you know?
Oh, okay. Sure.
So that means that, like, once you spent 14 years in the system, you have to essentially walk away from that 14 years of equity you saved up. And a lot of public safety, like fire and police pensions, are the same way, where you get probably quite a few guys that probably should have retired a while ago, but they end up staying in the job because they're tied to that state retirement system. It really is kind of terrible, honestly. It ends up people end up trapped in jobs that they really shouldn't be in for much longer than they should be. You know, it should be, I don't know. I always thought it should be like a 401k, man. You should be able to take it with you. Like, you build up whatever equity you have. Now, of course, like the solvency factor of public pension systems is a whole nother question for another day.
Yeah, sure.
You know, I mean, that's probably part of why they won't let you take it out and take it with you, because they literally doesn't exist anymore. They already spent it on something else.
Yeah. But it'd be nice to at least be extended the promise.
Certainly,
if not the reality.
Exactly. Right. But yeah, man, that's it. And also too, there are another thing is that's unique about the military is that so much of your kind of your daily day-to-day life is governed by the personality of your command staff. For example, we had a first sergeant who just had a terrible home life. He hated his wife, and they just could not stand each other. And
Mm,
as a result, number one, he was absolutely miserable. But number two, he made us stay late about every single night because he didn't want to go home.
perfect.
Yes.
Thanks.
Right. And there's nothing you can do about it. You can't quit, you know? You can't, you might be able to transfer to a different unit if you have a good enough reason, if you've been there for long enough, maybe. But
Hmm.
yeah, there's very little you can do about it.
Hmm. Yeah. One, if you could touch on the what I've found interesting is you excuse me. So the majority of Americans, when they hear, "Oh, someone has a drug problem," we automatically assume a lot. Like there's this whole book of like assumptions that we
Certainly.
make. Your Could you touch on the background to your drug dependency, and then also um how it progressed once you got out? Because
Absolutely.
you've talked a little bit about separation anxiety, and I think that's as you say, it's not as necessarily severe as PTSD or whatnot, but it's definitely under recognized. Um, so yeah, those two aspects, I guess.
Sure. So you're absolutely right because I do the same thing too, and I know better at this point in time.
Yeah,
But so and I don't want people to get the wrong idea. It's not like I had some absolutely crazy tour where I was like the only survivor out of my unit. It wasn't like that, man. I mean,
right.
yeah, sir, I certainly observed plenty of ugly things that people just shouldn't experience ever. Period.
Sure.
I certainly dealt with my fair share of trauma, both physical and emotional. But it wasn't like I had like one of these like Marcos Luttrell lone survivor things. Like
Hmm.
it
Sure.
wasn't that crazy. However, when we got back stateside, I was fine for about 6 months there. And I was just kind of cruising along, and I plan on staying in the army long term, so I was just getting into the groove essentially. And after several months there, I started to have problems sleeping. It kind of started gradually at first, where I'd wake up in the middle of the night once, or maybe twice, or maybe 3 times a week, and it eventually progressed to where I was like a full blown insomniac, and I was spending
Hmm.
more nights up than I was sleeping. And if you've ever had a period of time where you've lost a lot of sleep, like it really starts kind of wearing on your nerves there for
Yeah.
after a little while. And I mean, they've found like people that have been sleep deprived for as little as 72 hours, their brains like on an MRI look like that of a schizophrenic. I mean, it totally
Hmm.
messes with your nervous connections and how your brain works and things like that. Yeah, it's pretty wild.
Sure.
But I had a lingering back injury that got worse as time went on, and my insomnia was getting worse until it got to the point where I couldn't no longer hide the fact that my back was hurt. I ended up having to go to see the PA, who was our you know was our who's our medical platoon commander too,
Hmm.
and he had given me a prescription for some prescription pain pills, and it was only for a short. It was for a short. I think it was like a 14-day supply, maybe a 21-day supply, something like that. And one thing that is not really known is that the army used to hand out pain pills like candy at this point in time. I mean,
Sure.
prescription opiates were, I think, I think Vicodin specifically was the most heavily prescribed drug in the army for quite a while. They're like back in the mid 2000s. Obviously, they've throttled way back on
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
now, but that used to be. I mean, that used to be totally a thing. And one of the most, I think, instructive pictures I've ever seen was this guy who's got his full size ruck on his back. He's probably carrying 60, 70, 80 pounds of gear, and he's on crutches. Or it's like,
Oh wow.
this guy's obviously got something wrong with one of his legs, but here he is carrying this huge, heavy load still.
Right.
And I mean, that's the
Huh.
thing, man. It's a cultural thing too. It's like you you really do have to know the difference between this hurts and this is hurting me, of course, because everything hurts. I mean, it's
Mm-hmm.
really being in part of combat arms. It is a pretty physically demanding job. It's pretty tough, man. It really is, and you do have to be in good shape. But there's um there's definitely a lot of pressure for you to push yourself further than you should. And also you have the fact that you have extremely heavy loads that guys are being placed under. I mean, you're my combat load's over 100 pounds. I think it was 105 pounds last
Oh
time I.
wow.
Yeah, so you have your battle rattle, right, which is what every infantryman carries. That's about 90 pounds. Plus, I have my med bag and my fluids, which is another about 20 to 25 pounds. So
Okay. Yep.
you do the math, you end up with about 105 to 110. Okay, and this is on a guy. I weighed 150 pounds back then. I'm not. I was not a big dude by any means.
Wow.
So right. So how many months can you carry a load like that before it starts to really really wear
Mm.
on your back and your knees and your ankles? And how many times can you bend and twist and at weird angles walking over rough terrain or getting in and out of a vehicle before you really start to have problems? And the
Mm.
answer is not very many, because what they've seen is time and time. I mean, there was one thing I noticed when I was working in the clinic is that we get so many guys coming through that had that were 19 to 20 years old, that had just gotten out of basic and just gotten to their first duty station, and they would have hip problems or knee problems or back problems. Like, guys are way too young to be having these issues. And that was a real problem too for the command staff, because if you have any one of those problems, you can't wear body armor and therefore you can't deploy. So
Mm.
essentially they'd have a whole list of guys that were taking up space on their roster they couldn't do anything with. So it wasn't just me by any stretch of the imagination. And anyway, I gotten hurt to the point where I couldn't hide it anymore. I decided I was going to go take the pills that was given to me, and by some some miracle, once I started taking them, I was able to sleep. And not only was I
Hmm.
able to sleep, I was able to sleep better than I had for years.
Wow.
Yes. So while the pain relief from my back was great,
Mm-hmm.
the the relief I got from sleeping was what I became really, really dependent on.
Right. Oh yeah. Hundred
So
percent.
yeah. So after that prescription had ran out, I went back to try to get more. And PA told me, like, look, man, I can't do anything else for you. If you want to put in and get you want to get seen for a disability or a like a chronic pain issue or something like that, okay, fine, you know, but I can't do anything else for you, like in the outpatient setting,
Mm-hmm.
essentially. And I knew at that point in time that if you had any type of major injury like that, especially if you were like one of the SF guys that the government had spent millions of dollars training, you could probably lose a freaking leg, and if you wanted to stay in, you could probably finagle it. But if you're just a regular line medic, if you're just a grunt, man, and I'm
Yep.
not a grunt, I was pogue,
Yeah. Yeah.
but I hung out with the grunts a lot. But if you're just some, if you're just some schmuck at telly that's a regular army nobody, like, if you have any major issues with you, your ass is you're done.
Yeah.
They're
Yep.
gonna they're gonna medically separate you, and yeah, they might cover your injury, but your career in the army's over.
Mm-hmm.
And it was the same thing with psychiatric issues. I saw for myself firsthand plenty of times where guys, we used to call them checkouts, right? Where they would have some kind of psychological breakdown, and they would check themselves out of the unit, and we'd never see them again, or they get discharged, or they get sent home.
Sure.
And there was there was one time where a guy had a physical or a psychological breakdown in our unit, and after he had come back and gotten his gear and gotten cleaned out his room in the barracks and everything like that. That day, our platoon sergeant got us all together and berated us for half an hour, saying that, look, nobody's gonna play this fucking PTSD bitch bullshit. There's nothing wrong with you. Suck it up. If I catch another one of you motherfuckers going and crying to that psych nurse about this, you're gonna have bigger problems than your bad dreams you're having. Like, so
Yep.
obviously in this kind of environment, I'm not really feeling too good about going down to mental health and describing my sleeping problems.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah.
Even though it was number 2 drug prescribed in the army has to be Ambien, because it wasn't just me having problems sleeping. That's a very common thing, whether it's
Yeah.
just the anxieties or being away from home or having more serious psychological issues. Like, there's a lot of motherfuckers walking around at night can't sleep in the barracks. You know,
Yeah.
3 o'clock, you don't go downstairs to the smoke pit. There's a bunch of people hanging out there. So, anyway, this was the environment I was existing in. So I made what I thought was a temporary decision. I was like, well, I'm sure I can find somebody around here who's got a couple Percocets. It shouldn't be that hard. Sure enough, it wasn't, because one of the best places if you're ever looking for drugs is on a military base. You can get whatever you want,
Right.
whether it's GHB or date rape drugs or acid or whatever, man. You can find it, no problem. So that's what I did. I ended up, meeting up with a friend of a friend of a friend, and I got pain pills to them, and everything was great for several months there. And I didn't want to admit it at the time, but my habit was starting to get away from me to the point where I couldn't really control it anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And that eventually all came to a head because there was so we have like secure drugs, like we have drugs that are not controlled substances, and we have drugs obviously that are controlled substances, and they're kept under lock and key, and they have these they have these seals on where it's almost like a zip tie, and it has like a number stamped on it, and to open the cabinet or the bag or whatever, you have to break the seal. And when you break that seal, you're supposed to record the number of the new one you put on in the logbook. And this is how they track who opens the cabinet and who doesn't, and like who counted the drugs last, and who was gotten in there for what reason. Because every single milligram of controlled drugs that's in our possession, like, we have to account for. Even if if you give part of a vial of whatever drug it is, and you have to waste the rest, like, somebody has to witness you like taking the syringe and like squirting it in the toilet and flushing it.
Sure.
So essentially you have to account for it. It's no different than in a hospital or in an EMS system or anything. So anyway, when they do a monthly audit of these drugs, and our unit went and did their audit, and they found like, oh shit, we're missing a bunch of narcotics. What the hell just happened? So they round up all of us, all the medics and all the nurses, and we all have to take a drug test. So guess who tests positive for
the guy who didn't have anything to do with the missing narcotics.
Yes. But try telling them that.
Yeah, right.
So I think is probably could be reasonably expected. I got the 3rd degree on that one by the guys in civilian clothes, in suits. Those guys who nobody likes to see on post. And they gave me the 3rd degree, but I really didn't have anything to do with it. Eventually I found out years later that it was a nurse who had also a drug problem that worked there. And of course, when this whole thing happened, did she speak up and admit to her wrongdoing? No, of course not. Right. She was happy to let me take the fall for it. And nothing ended up coming of that, because most of the drugs that were stolen were either I think it was midazolam, if I remember right, morphine sulfate, and I think the other one was a bunch of ketamine. But so none of those drugs were in my system, and none of those drugs were in my bunk room at the time.
Sure.
Even though I did get in trouble not really in trouble, but they did. Their suspicion was raised because I had a bunch of IV supplies in my room, and I also had some bags of fluid too. Mm-hmm. And this is not for any nefarious purpose. One time-honored tradition in the Army is guys would come up and get IVs after a weekend of hard drinking.
Yep.
A lot of times, yeah. And I mean, it was like a freaking dialysis clinic there on the weekends, man. I mean, everybody in our room every bed had some dude who half passed out with a needle in his arm, laying there getting a bag of of fluid. It was God, it's so strange looking back on it now.
Yeah. Well, that's how you stay tight with the grunts, is you help them out with stuff like that.
Oh, absolutely, man. Yep. Yeah. Now, the problem is then they kind of get the idea that it's okay to come and wake you up at 3 o'clock in the morning and jump in your bed with you and all kinds of weird stuff like that. But yeah, it's,
they're drunk. The protocol is not high on their priority.
No, definitely not.
Or politeness.
Oh, no, definitely not. But so anyway, that was pretty much that. I mean, I got put on restriction, and I was informed a couple days later that I was going to be administratively separated by the battalion commander. And I didn't really understand what that meant. If I did understand what that meant at the time, I probably would have fought it a little harder, but I just thought I was just getting discharged. I didn't realize that it was like a punitive thing, even though I should have known better, because really all I did was I failed a drug test. And that's not something that happens infrequently in the Army. I mean, they have a whole substance abuse program, and like the way that typically works too is like if you go in and you tell your command that you have a problem, they'll put you through the program, you successfully complete it, and then you get out, you essentially have a clean slate. You're going to get discharged, but you'll get an honorable discharge.
Sure.
Now, if you're what's called command referred, so if they catch you like passing out, nodding out in the job, like during duty hours, they're like, okay, you have a drug problem, take a drug test, you fail it, so they send you through the program, you'll still get, if you complete it, you'll still get discharged, but I think you just get a general discharge. I can't exactly remember how it works, but anyway.
Okay.
They can bypass that whole system. And that's essentially what they did with me, is that I got hit with an Article 15 for failing a drug test, and I was administratively separated from the Army after essentially pleading guilty. And because I already had confessed to it, like doing drugs,
Sure.
and
Yeah.
they essentially had me dead to rights. So there was no sense in trying to fight it anymore after that. And now looking back, I probably could have, and I think that I might have gotten a little different result if I had maybe hired a lawyer or something. I don't know, man. It probably
maybe come out a little cleaner at least and help your later life. Yeah.
But see, that's the thing about administrative separations is that commanders have so much latitude, is that there's very little you can actually do. So anyway, I had about 15 days there when I was waiting on the paperwork to clear, where I was out of the military essentially, but I was still on post. And one of the things that really sucked, that I still think about a lot actually, is that once word had gotten around what had happened, it had all the guys in my unit who had been my best friends, just the day before. Stupid cat, sorry. The guys that had been my best friends the day before, they essentially acted like I had like leprosy, man, or AIDS or something, and they wouldn't even talk to me.
Yeah.
It was almost like I'd let them down more than I'd let myself down. It's just like the groupthink on that type of stuff, man. It's really strong. It was not the first time I'd seen it, not by a long shot. There were plenty of other times where somebody had done something kind of stupid or something they shouldn't have, and they had brought kind of ill repute on the unit.
Sure.
And guys, especially guys that want to be NCOs, they start thinking that somehow they're going to get associated with your bad reputation, which is not the way things work at all in the Army. So they're real quick to turn their backs on you. Man, that kind of whole brotherhood thing, man, it doesn't really go as far as it should. I mean, that's not to say it doesn't for other people, man, but it certainly didn't for me. I found out that was a one-way street in this situation. So that was the end of my time in the Army. And at this time, I mean, I had a full-blown drug problem already. I didn't quit using until like way later. And I was back kind of out in the world. So I essentially drifted through life for quite a while. I mean, I was, working odd jobs here and there. I worked for an EMS system for a little while. Didn't end up turning out very well, because I ended up failing a drug test there too. Lost that job, and eventually I moved back to where I came from, and I kind of settled down there, and I started selling pain pills. So to address your question of kind of the stigmas that people have around drug use. Yeah, I think that people do have this kind of picture in their head of some like disgusting, filthy, cracked out person sitting in a room that has no furniture in it, that's like they're huddled around like a 55-gallon drum that has like an open fire in it, and they're like, shooting up some crazy concoction, and then they go out and rape kids and murder people and things like that. And people certainly, they get the kind of the notion that drug addicts are not to be trusted. That one might be a little more true than I think.
Sure.
Than some of the other kind of preconceptions, because that's just the bottom line, man. There's nothing kind of intrinsic about drug use that turns you into a bad person, but it certainly makes you reveal more of who you already are. And if you're a piece of shit if you're a piece of shit when you're sober, you're gonna be a piece of shit when you do drugs too. But I think the real thing is that drugs are artificially expensive. I mean, the cost of like street drugs is artificially inflated because they're illegal. You can't go to CVS and buy them. There's no real competition. There's black markets make everything worse. The purity goes down. we see harder and harder drugs because they're easy to transport across the border, and price goes up.
Mm-hmm.
So what happens is that people that wouldn't normally do like extreme things, they end up going and robbing banks or stealing from people or breaking into houses to support their habit, or they turn to prostitution or whatever.
Yeah.
And because you don't see, nobody ever robs a bank to buy a 40 ounce of liquor, man. It just, it just doesn't happen. And that's because you can go to any corner store, give them $1.99 and get your fix for the day. And I think a lot of drug use would be the same way. Now, of course, this does not excuse people's individual behavior. I did plenty of shitty things when I was on drugs. I did plenty of shitty things beforehand too. But that's just it, man. Is that there is as much as some of those stereotypes are true, where people are not nearly as trustworthy when they have an active drug addiction. Sometimes people are turned into pathological liars. That's absolutely true too. Not always, but sometimes. Just as much as some of those stereotypes are true, it's also, though, there's plenty of people out there that you would never knew they had a drug problem unless they, for some reason, told you. There's plenty of people that are high functioning addicts. They're successful in whatever they decide to do for a living. They're able to keep a lid on it for whatever reason. That was never me, man. I don't do anything like that in life. I'm always balls to the wall, no matter what it is, whatever I do. I have two speeds, off and on.
Right.
But there are people out there that are able to kind of keep a lid on it that you'd never suspect of doing drugs. But at the same time, I don't know, man. It's one of those things where, unfortunately, because of the circumstances that are surrounding drug use and addiction, like the one thing I think is a misconception is that people typically don't get high to feel good. People get high to feel normal. I think almost to a fault. Most people are self-medicating for some kind of psychological trauma or emotional issue, or maybe they were physically abused as a child or something. The people I've met in my travels that have had serious drug problems, there's always some underlying serious reason why. It's never, nobody's ever like, well, you know what? I just felt like doing heroin this morning, so I just got up and I scored a bag and now I'm addicted. No, nobody has like a great life and decides to go try heroin. That's just not how it works. Like people are trying to fill a hole that exists in them. And I mean, some people fill that hole with fast cars and women. Some people fill that hole with food or booze, and some people fill it with, needles and heroin or whatever. And really, it's like the same thing where, essentially, especially like in a military context, I mean, there's a lot of people in the Army that have been discharged for doing drugs. You can find drugs on any military base you want. And also there's a whole class of people. I've never been able to get a fix on the number. It's somewhere between 7,000 and 75,000 guys in kind of my situation that were administratively separated. They got an other than honorable discharge for drug use, essentially. For some strange reason, the federal government does not keep close statistics on that. Weird, huh?
I think one thing that really you were saying there that agrees with your experience, where you weren't taking the pain or the pain pills so you felt like Superman. You were just taking them so you could sleep.
Yeah.
And I think that's definitely that definitely challenges the general conception. Is your progression was very logical. It's again, like you were saying, the perception is some whacked out weirdo. It's almost anybody could see themselves taking pain pills if they're in a certain situation, especially that kind, and then being denied them when you're needing some sort of assistance, and then it's just cut off.
Mm-hmm. Especially if you're physically dependent on them.
Yeah. Who couldn't see themselves at best sitting there in a quandary, like, okay, what do I do now? I really need this. So that helped me, hearing that story, helped me get a better handle on that, and not just be so, I guess not black and white. What's a term for when oh my gosh, I'm so dumb.
Dismissive?
No, sure. Let's go with that.
I'm just throwing it out
Stereotype.
there.
There we go.
Sure,
There we
yeah,
go.
for sure, man.
Yeah. It's easy to stereotype something, but the reality is, no, it's very logical. Maybe, as you say, it's not necessarily good,
No,
but
but yeah,
almost anybody can understand that process.
yeah, and I think that's actually like on a bigger point. I think that's kind of one benefit of the whole opiate epidemic, man, is it's kind of changed people's perception on what a drug addict is. Because at least like I'm from Appalachia, right? So this is like the epicenter of opiate addiction in America, right? And what's happened, man, is that drug addiction went from something that happened in big cities to like crackheads and stuff to like people's cousins and sisters and daughters and sons, people that we know, and it's absolutely wreaked havoc on communities, small communities around here, man. I mean, like there's like we like at the department I work at, dude, we run overdoses all the time, and I mean every town, somebody knows somebody who's a drug addict, or somebody, people know somebody who's died of an overdose or something like that, and I think it's made this problem kind of hit home with people a lot more. I think that's one kind of silver lining of the whole issue. But that's how the majority, not the majority, but a large number of addicts in my generation, that's how they became drug addicts, is that they started with a legitimate prescription from a doctor for a pain issue. It gets cut off, and by that point it's too late. And unfortunately, they haven't really figured out a solution. Like here where I'm from, man, like the state government decided to limit doctors' prescriptions to like 5 days for an injury, which is not a good system. It doesn't work out very well. It hasn't either. It hasn't made a dent in drug addiction issues around here. But on top of that, too, I think also something else about my story is that people don't think of soldiers as having drug problems, but it's exceptionally common.
Sure.
And it's not just limited to drugs either, man. I mean, it's actually pretty obvious too, because anybody that spent time on a military base knows that alcohol involved incidents are one of the major reasons that the police get called, and then one of the major reasons that somebody's commander gets called in the middle of the night to come and pick them up because they did something stupid while they were drunk, or they got busted drinking and driving. I mean, it's happened to plenty. That's happened to plenty of guys. More than one guy's gotten relieved of their command because of that. And of course, more than one sergeant major's had their drinking and driving covered up too because of who they were. But that's just the thing, man, is that there's really not much difference between what guys do to self-medicate with alcohol versus what guys do to self-medicate with pain pills, except for the social aspect. That's really it. And it just kind of happened that, I mean, I was drinking plenty at the time too. It just never really did it for me. But there's alcohol is just baked into the culture of military institutions in America, man. It's just how it is. And there's a lot of kind of irresponsible behavior and usage around alcohol that really just kind of gets accepted by commanders as like, these are young guys. They're a bunch of hard chargers, and that's what they're going to do is get wasted. Where it's just accepted as a given. And, it's like, well, maybe these guys are drinking heavily because they are, number one, they're bored.
Right. Yeah.
There are a few things worse than being stuck on post on a weekend, because you can't leave, unless you are actually granted leave. But there's that's a military's a sausage fest. There's not a lot of girls around, not usually. Your options for stuff to do are usually pretty limited. So the one thing you can do is get wasted, and that's one thing. But also, I mean, there's tons of guys that come back. That's how they kind of decompress from deployments, is by heavy drinking. I mean, that's also, of course, one thing that we all kind of bond over is kind of we sit around and like the most screwed up, crappiest moments of our lives, they get told, out drinking around a fire at 3:00 in the morning. It's just kind of this medium we use to kind of share traumatic experiences, I guess. But there's really very little difference between that and taking pain pills so you can sleep. There's really not. So one thing that I think that a perception that a lot of people that don't have a lot of experience in the military tend to have is they tend to think that guys in the military are just like paragons of virtue and they never do anything wrong or illegal. But if that was true, there wouldn't be any such thing as military police, now would there?
Right.
Right. So, but the truth is that the U.S. military is it is a microcosm of American society. There's plenty of fantastic people and there's plenty of dirtbags too.
Mm-hmm.
So just because guys are all wearing the same uniform and they happen to live in a little walled-in community, that doesn't mean they're any different from the rest of America. And yeah, there's plenty of illegal shit that goes on in military bases. Oh, the only thing I didn't mention, like my due station the whole time I was in the Army was Fort Hood. And dude, there's all kinds of crazy shit that goes on. I mean, that Vanessa Guillen murder down there made a lot of national news. Yep. Like that's one thing, dude, where it's like if you go out, there's like a bunch of north of the base there. That's where the ranges are. So like that's where the tanks go out and do their maneuvers, or like if you're going out to the field, chances are you're going to go out there and there's an artillery range. And I promise you, if somebody was to go through that area with a fine tooth comb, they'd find plenty of bodies buried out. Yeah. And that was like she's not the only person that's ever disappeared from down there. There's quite a few other ones too.
Yeah.
I mean, there was like there's like cartel involvement, a bunch of crazy shit like that down there, man. There's they had a sting operation a while back where they were essentially luring NCOs to this real crappy hotel that's in Killeen, which is in the city that's right next to it, and they were essentially kind of like tempting them with prostitutes, and there's a bunch of guys that got jammed up during that, man. So there's all kinds of seedy behavior.
Sure. What one question I like to ask for any younger listener that managed to struggle through this long of the episode, get this far into it. Or just anybody really, just give an idea. If a young person, 16, 18, or whatever, came up to you and said, "Hey, I want to join the military," just generally the military, what would your advice be to them?
I'm not going to tell them no, as much a lot of people I think would expect I would, because honestly, while it made me the person I am, and I feel pretty good looking in the mirror today at myself with who I am. And the experiences I had, certainly they kind of they did shape me in a major way. They made me somebody that I'm okay with looking at the mirror at today. There were a lot of experiences that I would have never had I not joined the military. I mean, I probably would have never even left the country, if I'd never joined the service. But I think also too, it's important that if a young person wants to join the military, they need to go in eyes open. Like I do think, if you have a better idea of what you're getting yourself into and you want to do it, hey, I'd support you. I'm all for it. I think it can be a really positive thing for somebody starting out in life, honestly. Because as much as we have, this view of the world the way it should be, the fact of the matter is it's not that way. So we have to exist kind of in the way, we have to exist in institutions the way they are. So with that said, there are plenty of positive opportunities for you to kind of give yourself a leg up in life. You can learn some fantastic skills. You can learn some fantastic job skills and get some great experiences. But with that said, number one is that you are taking risks here. You're taking risks with your physical health. Number one, like it's pretty easy to get hurt and some pretty, you talk to vets, man, you're not going to meet hardly one guy that doesn't have back problems or some kind of chronic pain or migraines or something like that, or TBIs too. That's a really common one.
Yeah. Or even tendinitis?
Tinnitus. I deal with tinnitus all the time, man. Yeah, crappy, earplugs and gunshots and stuff like that, man. That'll do it. But not only that, but also the fact that you're also taking a risk to your kind of emotional health and well-being. Is that you are entering a machine that has chewed up and spit out plenty of people. So I think that's something that's important to contend with and to be aware of. And I think that unfortunately there's really no ways to kind of get around that. I mean, the fact of the matter is you're going to be dealing with this giant faceless, soulless bureaucracy for a lot of important things that you're going to need or want. So you have to understand that. You have to understand, obviously, that you're going to be taking orders every day for the entirety of your contract. Obviously, I mean that one's I think is that one's covered by conventional wisdom.
Mm-hmm.
However, though, if somebody kind of understands those two things, I mean, it also kind of depends on the operational tempo. Like right now, the U.S. military is not deploying nearly as heavily as they were back when I was in. So you might
Sure.
spend 5 years in and not do anything or go anywhere. That's entirely possible. But also that means, accepting the fact that you might have major disruptions in your life. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, one thing that I think guys kind of don't really realize is that you might meet some girl in 2 years after you join and decide you want to get married, settle down, and start a family. That's a hard thing to do
Yep.
if you're in the military. I mean,
Yeah.
there's a reason that divorces are so high, and that's like because it's one of those jobs that requires you to spend a lot of time away from home, and you don't get paid very much. That's the other thing too is that the other piece of advice I would give is that one thing you can do if you do it right is while you're in the barracks is you can stack up a lot of cash. And that's exactly what you should be doing. So skip the buy here, pay here. Skip the Mustang. Don't do it. Don't buy a motorcycle. You shouldn't
But
buy
that
it. You
sweet
should
12.9 APR.
right.
Or whatever.
Yes.
Yeah.
Exactly. So that would be the other thing I would definitely recommend is that if you do it right, you can set yourself up for life in the long term. So I'm not saying that nobody should do it, but I think that you should talk to guys that have had positive and negative experiences in the Army too, because my experience was in a lot of ways negative, but there was also plenty of positives too. So that's what I would really recommend is getting information from real sources, like not from your recruiter or commercials or obviously movies or TV or anything like that, or Task and Purpose because they just kind of suck anyway. But going out and talking to vets, like maybe friends or brothers or sisters of friends or something like that. And also too, it also is important to kind of speak to somebody that's been in the military recently, because like the things that my dad experienced in the 90s, it's not the same anymore. It's just it's not the same when I was in, man. Like I know the whole kind of woke thing gets overplayed now, but there's some reality to that, man.
Mm-hmm.
There's kind of like they're like the diversity and inclusion officers, and that kind of whole corporate culture has bled over into the Army, man. When even when I was in, there was like the EO. There was an EO officer, equal opportunity officer, in every unit. So like the Army, politics is downstream from culture 100%.
Mm-hmm.
The Army is governed by politics and culture. So it's downstream from both. So that's something to keep in mind too, is that the dominant culture in America might not be one that you necessarily kind of like very much, but you're going to get exposed to some of that stuff in the military.
Yeah.
I actually did a podcast episode on this I think it's almost a year ago. I have to send it to you so you can put it in the show notes. But it was one I did with Pat. It was before you joined the military, and it was just kind of a list of things to understand. And it's like I really don't want people to get the wrong idea, man. I'm not saying like, oh, you should never do it. It's terrible for everybody. It just sucks. That's not what I'm trying to get across here. But I also want people to know that there's some, just like everything, there's trade-offs to be had.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, the biggest ones of those is you lose a lot of your autonomy and your kind of your personal free will. You lose a lot of your independence. You are trapped in a system that's much larger. You're not trapped, but you're going to be there stuck in a system that's much larger than you are, which also by result can crush you like a bug if it wants to. So keep that in mind too. But that's the main thing, is that a lot of your personal freedom and choice is going to be taken away from you for an extended period of time. If that's something that really bothers you, you're probably not going to like it very much.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that's good. I appreciate the insight.
Of course.
One you did mention right there might be a good thing to wrap up on. You mentioned the podcast. You want to tell the listener just a little bit? I don't have much in the text of in the description. So tell the listener a little bit about your podcast and what you got going there.
Sure. So the podcast is a project I have with my buddy Nick, and it originally started out as a way for me to kind of rant about all the problems I see about with the military today and about how the military's mission and kind of federal politics and things like that. But the show's been around for about 2 years, and ever since then, it's kind of grown and developed in a lot of different directions now to where we still talk about that stuff some, but most of what kind of the show is morphed into now is it's about history.
Mm-hmm.
And especially military history. And I like to kind of give you a vet's insight of what historical events might have actually been like.
Sure.
Especially from like the grunt's eye view. That's what I like to focus on a lot. Right now, I'm in the middle of doing a series on the Irish Revolution. And a lot of the topics we're going to cover is going to be things like irregular warfare and kind of subversion and I was going to say sedition, subversion, and sabotage. But I mean, that's really actually a lot of what the Irish Revolution kind of revolves around. And I think it has a lot of important lessons for us today in a rapidly changing political environment in America, to where the idea is to know the past so you can, have some insight in what's going on today, and therefore plan accordingly for the future. So that's the idea behind the podcast. It's called The Status Quo, and you can find it on any major podcaster. That's STATIST, by the way, too.
Sure.
And let's see. I think that's about it. There's about 130 episodes. As of right now, every episode we've ever done is still available for public consumption. Pretty soon, those will be going off of the major podcasting sites. So still be able to find them on their website, which is www. Oh, geez. It's been such a long time since I said it. I think it's thestatusquo.net. Jeez, man.
They'll have to look you up.
I guess, apparently. But
yeah,
it is, if you search the Status Quo, it's, every major podcatcher.
The podcast, yes, the Status Quo. Yeah, and I'll say, I mean, obviously just hearing your story was a big part of listening to the podcast. And then also, like you say, just watching the transition, seeing the transition that happened from, like you say, just kind of ranting a little bit about what's going on and then finding a topic and focusing on that. That was pretty cool to see. But
Thanks,
but
man.
getting kind of, if the listener liked this little hour plus of insight into you and your story, they'll get a lot of that out of your podcast. So
yeah, and one thing I wanted to add about that too, I think a lot of what that's been, and we really didn't talk about it much on this episode, but I've dealt with post-traumatic stress disorder for a long time now, coming up on probably about 15 years. And it's kind of gone in ebbs and flows. It's changed the course of my life, obviously, by a pretty considerable margin. But it's also something that I've learned to kind of deal with, and I've kind of learned to deal with, things I've seen and done and experienced in my life. And so much of that transition we're kind of talking about comes from being at peace now, because I spent such a long time being just so pissed off at the U.S. government, at the Army, at the generals, at politicians, at George W. Bush, and all these. I spent so much bandwidth being pissed off at all these people that didn't even know I existed, and I finally got to the point where I could be at peace and let that stuff go.
Thank you for listening to this episode of How I Embraced the Suck. If you enjoyed the show, tell a friend. And as my Girl Scout den mother used to say, stay frosty.
Yeah, and I mean, a lot of those things are stuff that people don't know about either, too. That's one thing I do really enjoy, is trying to bring up much more obscure kind of period of time in American history.